Hello, everyone. My name is Neil Harris, and I'm delighted to be with you today for this Gallery Teachers Masterclass, which we're calling Cutting to the Chase, Maximising Learning Time and Reducing ELT Fluff. So you might be wondering why I've called this Reducing ELT Fluff. So let me explain that slightly unusual title right now, right at the start of this presentation. So in my 20 years of experience as a teacher trainer, working with pre-service, newly qualified and qualified in-service teachers, quite often I find aspects of their lessons, and I've also been guilty of this myself, where we're not really making the most of the students' time for learning. In American English, we have this word fluff, unnecessary extras that don't lead to any benefit for, in this case, the learners. So I'm sure as teachers around the world, we're all committed to making the amount of time that we have in the classroom as useful, as beneficial as possible. If we cut out the fluff, the idea is that the students will have more time for learning, and that's all about what we're looking at today. Let me introduce you then, therefore, to the topics of today's presentation. So the areas that we'll be looking at are, number one, warmers and lead-ins. They're important, but they can go on for too long. We'll get an idea of what would be a good length in terms of the class, but also how it relates, these opening stages, to the content, the main event of the lesson. We'll then move on to look at two acronyms, VAKOG and MI. And they come from really the 1990s. And a lot of, at the time, very interesting work looking at learning styles. But as neuroscience and evidence-based learning becomes more and more important and informs how we teach, we'll have come to an understanding that a number of these VAKOG, neuro-linguistic programming, and MI, multiple intelligences activities, really don't get us anywhere. And I'll explain how that all works. I then want to look at the idea of pre-teaching vocabulary, something you see in classrooms all over the world. But should we do it? Does it help? We'll find out. And then finally, I'll look at the idea of making feedback as efficient as possible before concluding with, obviously, some conclusions, trying to draw together some ideas about how we can have impactful learning and fluff-free learning. So I'd like to begin by asking you a question, which I'd be grateful, please, if you can answer in chat. And the question is this one: how long are your lessons? And typically, how many lessons per week do your students have? And I'll give you a few moments just to put your answers into chat. Thank you. Okay, and now another question, if I may. What percentage of your lesson typically is taken up by that first stage of a warmer or a lead-in? And again, a few moments to put the percentage, please, into chat. Percentage is important because whether your lesson is half an hour, 2 hours, we'll all be talking in the same language of 5%, 10%, 25%, or whatever it is. Okay. Great. So good to see answers for both of those questions coming in. And I think this is really helpful because it informs some of the points that I'm going to be making now about what I've called the principled use of warmers. So let's have a look about what all of that means. So here on screen is a picture, and what we can clearly see is a group of football players warming up. And my question to you to think about in your head is, why are they even bothering to do this? Well, you probably can see from my build, I'm no football player. I'm not a sportsman at all. But I do have friends who love football, who love going to the gym. And they all tell me, Neil, the key is in warming up. And there is a relationship, therefore, between physically getting ready for the game, getting those muscles nice and ready, and peak performance on the pitch. And therefore, it's not surprising that as English language teachers, many of us get involved in helping our students to be peak performers in their English classes. However, there is perhaps a problem. And for this, I want to actually step back and just question this idea of, well, actually, what is a warmer? Why do we bother? Well, there's quite a lot of, not disagreement, but some people use the word warmer to mean one thing and a lead-in to mean something else. And if that's something that you are interested in, there's a link here, which will come up in the list of recommended reading later on, to a blog post on eltnotebook.blogspot.com that looks at the ways that some teachers differentiate between warmers and lead-ins. Actually, I don't think really they're that different, as long as they are being used for a meaningful purpose. In other words, the principled use. So I've taken from Scott Thornberry's new A to Z of ELT, a quotation, and I've highlighted for you here on screen what I think are the key elements of warmers / lead-ins. And Scott writes, they serve either to energize learners. You want learners who are awake and interested in your classes, of course, or to prepare them for the activity sequence that follows. Therefore, in my view, the secret to a good opening stage of any lesson is that we energize the learners, we get them interested and excited, but also we prepare for them for that activity sequence. There is therefore a clear relationship, probably even at a content level, between the activity sequence, the meat of the lesson, and the warmer. Let me give you an example of good and less good lead-in and warmers. So a dear friend of mine who I used to team teach with a lot had this fantastic activity whereby if he was opening a new unit of the coursebook with his learners, he would present them on the table as they walked in with a whole load of pictures that were thematically related to the topic. And around the edge of the piece of paper, some words which related to the topic. And as the students got to know Neil well, he had the same name as me, they would start looking at the vocabulary and realize that some of it related to photo 2 or photo 3, and they started making connections. And this is really what I mean by this double arrow here. We want there to be connections between the warmer / lead-in and the rest of the class. All too often, I go in and I see classes where there is no evidence of a link whatsoever. So another good warmer is 20 questions, where we ask students a series of questions and they have to say what they think the answer is. And 20 questions, if they're done quickly, it gets energy, it gets pace into the class. And it works really well, for example, if you want the students to work out a famous person that you're thinking of, that's in your head, because they're then going on to do a reading or a listening about that famous person. There's that nice link. But sometimes you go into classes and I see 20 questions where the students are asked to think about a famous person, and then they do a grammar class where there is no relationship whatsoever. That seems to me to be a lost opportunity and actually not particularly principled use of time. Now, another one that I see is where the students are all asked to stand up really important to get movement, particularly if you're teaching online. And, you're asked to kind of tap your head and, you're meant to be able to do, I can't do it at all, as you can see, but you're meant to tap your head and move your arm and then swap. Well, that came out of something we're going to look at in a few minutes' time, neuro-linguistic programming. And I promise you, it might be fun. And there's nothing wrong with fun in the classroom. Getting people laughing is great. But don't think this is going to make your students learn better. It's literally nothing more than a bit of fun. Now, I've also made reference to time, and have been really guilty of this. Warmers, lead-ins, they're energizing. The students are having fun. That's important. And more so when it's related to the topic of the class as it progresses. But don't get carried away. I have been guilty myself in a 90-minute lesson of still being involved in the warmer after 25 minutes. That's nearly a third of my lesson gone, and we haven't actually started doing anything that we're meant to be learning in terms of our learning objectives. You'll remember that lovely workshop recently from Holly. So I would suggest that in a class that hands over from teacher focus and teacher control at the beginning to that really important activation stage where the students are using language or they're able to demonstrate competence in a skills lesson, and therefore the lesson is handing over to them, that we are doing the students a misjustice if we spend too long on the warmer. Because all it means is that we're going to be rushing through the meat of the lesson, and we risk compromising either the quality or, in the worst case situation, even getting to that point where the students are able to use the language or the skill for themselves independently. And surely that is the desired outcome for any lesson that we teach. So moving on, I've already talked to you about some ways in which, great for a bit of fun, great to get the class up and moving, but not related to learning success. So I'd now like to ask you another question for you to answer in chat, please. And it's this one. Do you plan your lessons so that they provide input which, in your opinion, appeals to VAKOG, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, gustatory, and that appeals to multiple intelligence-based learning styles? So a few moments and answer this one in chat, please, with Y or yes or N, no. So again, just a few moments to wait for the answers to start coming in. Okay, interesting. Because it is very much the case that in the late 90s and the early 2000s, English language teaching was awash with people getting really excited about the 5 senses and how they were believed to contribute to better learning. So, for example, once you'd worked with a vocabulary set, the teacher might ask, what do these words smell like? Pick up these words, feel them. What do they feel like? What sound do you hear when you hear the word house? What picture do you have when you see the word chair? Now, the idea was that making sensory associations with language and the 5 senses would somehow enable learning. But it went further. It became very fashionable for teachers to look at the context of planning their lessons so that they appealed to different learning styles, that teachers wanted to cover learning that would be friendly for the visual learner, the auditory learner, the kinesthetic learner, and so on. Similar to this, and again related largely to planning, was Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. He believed that people's intelligence could be divided up into different areas. The people who liked working with other people, the interpersonal intelligence. The people who liked working on their own, the intrapersonal intelligence. The people who liked working with logical mathematical puzzles. The people who liked classifying things, the naturalist intelligence. However, with both the VAKOG system and the multiple intelligence system, there is one huge problem. It might have appealed to our sense as learners ourselves that perhaps we think we learn best by things that we see rather than things that we hear. But in fact, there is absolutely no evidence that planning lessons to appeal to those five senses, or planning lessons appealing to our students' different intelligence types, in fact, has any bearing on the quality of learning whatsoever. So some papers here, some articles here on screen, written, some of them quite recently, this one 2015, promoting some of these ideas. In this case, the teacher will prepare a set of teaching materials where the material has very tight relationship with activities done in class. This is talking about the relationship between VAKOG and what happens. So VAKOG as a way of planning lessons. Multiple intelligences, and again, a quotation. While not all questions about the science, that's an interesting word, of multiple intelligences have been answered, it can be extremely helpful in the classroom. Well, yeah, no, it is too good to be true. This is a table taken from a wonderful book on evidence-based learning, and it looks at the prevalence of neuromyths amongst practicing teachers in 5 different international contexts. It's too small to see all the details on screen, don't worry about that. But if we have a look at one of the measurements here, it is suggesting that something like 90% of teachers believed that teaching through the VAKOG system helped learning. It doesn't. And this was debunked very clearly by Carol Letherby and Patricia Harris in an article that they wrote called Learning Styles and Teacher Training, Are We Perpetuating Neuromyths? And yes, if you've been taught that your learners are visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, smell, gustatory, taste, and that therefore should inform how you teach them, there's no evidence for it whatsoever. As far as multiple intelligences is concerned, is that Gardner himself, as long ago as 1997, actually started to take a step back from his original theory. He now actually doesn't support it in the way that he did initially. And yet we're still seeing teachers being influenced by multiple intelligence theory. He's actually gone as far as saying, I made a mistake using the word intelligence. I should have talked about talent. So basically, what I'm encouraging you to do, if previously you've planned or you've provided activities for your students based on these 2 myths of learning, VAKOG, multiple intelligences, I'd frankly say, don't bother, because there is no evidence that it makes learning any better at all. Okay, so our next area of fluff, that of pre-teaching vocabulary. And I'm going to guess that many of you pre-teach vocabulary. Okay, so here's a quiz for you. You're going to see on screen 5 stages of a receptive skills lesson, reading or listening, as often taught on CELT. And I'd like you to decide, as you look at these 5 stages as they appear on screen, one of them is questionable. It's, in fact, probably fluff. But which one is it? Answers, if you like, into chat. Okay, all right. Again, some interesting results coming in. We're not entirely in agreement, but I'm seeing some answers coming in talking about questioning pre-teaching vocabulary, which is great because that is, in fact, the area which is questionable in terms of what we do in the reading skills and the listening skills classroom. I'm not saying that we should never pre-teach vocabulary. And let me give you an example of a time where you will want to pre-teach vocabulary. Imagine you're working with a group of young learners, 5, 6, 7 years old, and you're going to be looking at a storybook together. And the storybook is about the unicorn that had evil plans. Just imagine, we all thought unicorns were wonderfully happy beasts, but no, here's the unicorn with evil plans. And if we look at the text, we can see, not unexpectedly for a paragraph about unicorns, that the word unicorn keeps appearing time and time again. Now, let's be honest, if we're reading this out to a group of students and they don't know what a unicorn is, even though it introduces, this is actually taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica for kids, although it introduces what a unicorn is, if you've never heard of a unicorn before, you're going to think that the teacher's gone mad. A horse with a horn. So if we are working with a text and there is one central word that is key to understanding, and we think some of our students may not know it, then yes, of course, we want to pre-teach it. But what we want to avoid, and there is a wonderful video from Joe Kakonga all about this, is the pre-teaching of every single possible word that as the teacher we think the students may not know. And you think, well, isn't that going to make the reading more difficult? Well, yes, it is, potentially. So, if you've got a word like unicorn that's central to the text, pre-teach it. The key here is don't pre-teach all of the words they may not know. Well, what is the rationale for not pre-teaching? Well, for a start, it's going to take you forever to do it. I remember an observed class very early on when I was first working in a UK university. It was a 90-minute lesson, and I did a warmer that was about 25 minutes, and then I did a pre-teaching stage that was about 25 minutes. So basically, most of the lesson had finished before they even saw the reading. Not good. So don't teach lots of random words that you've selected from the text because the student may not know them, because they may not need them when they read the text. Secondly, even if you teach them, whether that will translate into them being more efficient readers, there's little evidence that this is the case. It won't help them very much. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, you want to keep an active class. You want your students to be engaged. And I promise you, if you spend half an hour doing a vocabulary matching activity with random words and the students don't even know why they're looking at them, your energy, your pace, that enthusiasm, that engagement will have gone through the floor. The students will not be wanting to read the text when they get to it. So instead, think about, are there keywords that they really do need to understand the basics of the test? And if so, yes, pre-teach those. You might decide to edit the text to simplify the difficult vocabulary that isn't really key to the reading task. You could provide a glossary, or you might simply decide to delay working on the vocabulary until the end of the activity. We therefore need to take a principled approach to the teaching of pre-teaching of vocabulary. And one of the best overviews, I think, that I found on this comes from the Active Learning in ELT blog. And the title is Questions About Pre-Teaching Vocabulary, and the link is available here. It introduces the fact that in many teacher training courses, even to this day, pre-teaching vocabulary is actually taught as something that's important, but it debunks this. This is from the ELT Nile glossary, which is an important teacher training organization, and it makes the point here that nowadays, though some question pre-teaching vocabulary, suggesting that contexts that teachers are able to set up for pre-teaching are rarely meaningful, and that pre-teaching, in fact, prevents learners from developing the attack strategies they need for dealing with challenging texts. If we keep pre-teaching the vocabulary, the day the student gets a text where the vocabulary hasn't been pre-taught, they're going to flounder. They're not going to know what to do. We need to teach them familiarity with ambiguity of unknown vocabulary. Again, I've picked this out in bold. So this really nice article talks about, to use pre-teaching vocabulary effectively, we need to clearly identify a rationale for including pre-teaching. It's not saying we never do it. It's saying if you're going to do it, be able to explain why. The words that you choose should be selected based on the rationale, and that the vocabulary learning that you design or the development exercises that you have are somehow related to the rationale itself. Okay, so in other words, we're not saying no pre-teaching of vocabulary, but what we are saying is, do you need to do it? If so, be careful with the words that you select. Make sure that they're key and core to the text, and you think about ways that match the way that the students are then going to read the text. Okay, and then my final stage looks at feedback. And a question for you, again, to put your answers into chat, please, is that when you're working with questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when you do feedback with the students, do you go through the answers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Does your feedback mechanism mirror exactly the order of the questions that the students have been answering? Okay, beginning to see some answers coming into chat. We've got a bit of a mixture here. Some of you saying yes, some of you saying not if it's not necessary. So in terms of feedback, I wanted to share with you how you might work on a reading text. So here is, in fact, this is taken from an exam class, and it's for medical English. So you've got questions 1 to 7. It's a matching activity. Which paragraph, which text does this information come from? A, B, C, or D? Then reading comprehension question, short answers. And then final set of questions where you complete a gap, taking information from the text. 20 questions in total. You might be forgiven that a typical way of doing this and the right way of doing this is that you go through it, question 1, question 2, question 3. Have you ever noticed how your students are half asleep by the time you get to question 10? Not a good way of doing things, because they probably don't need the same amount of time for each question. So what we need to consider is focused feedback. So how do we do this? Well, the first option is that you group the questions. In this test, it follows the grouping of the different types of questions. But if you're just doing a standard reading comprehension, the questions are all the same, and there are 15 questions, why not do questions 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15? When you've grouped the questions, you actually ask the students, okay, we're going to look at questions 1 to 7. Which ones do you want help with? You write up on the board the question number where they struggled. Then you do the same for questions, the next set of questions, and then the next set of questions. That gives you a shopping list of the questions where the student struggled. And what you can then do is work on those questions, plus any that you as the teacher noticed that the students also struggled with, but they didn't realize they were having problems with. Focus on the questions where they struggled, because that's where they need the most time and the most help. But of course, at the end, make sure that you do check the answers to the other questions quickly. And a way of doing that to add variety is by providing an answer key and asking the students, check your answers on this answer key. It could be a handout, could be on the board, could be on a shared screen, and then give the students the opportunity, any of those that you want to just ask about. Other options to make feedback more engaging is that you give the answer. So question 18 was text D, and the students then have to explain to you why. Or you highlight on the whiteboard, if you've got an interactive whiteboard, so much the easier, where in the text the answer's found. So these are the lines you should be looking at, and you say to the students, that's where the answer is, which answer is correct. So you're guiding them towards the right place. Or finally, another option is that you explain the reason. So the right answer is because, and then the students decide what the answer itself was. So at all times, there is probing of understanding rather than just mechanical, question 1A, question B, D, question 3C, and so on. Feedback should probe understanding, it should check understanding, but it also should be focused on where the needs exist. Okay, so my conclusions for today. Learning time is really precious. So we need to, as teachers, prioritize what's needed in terms of where the students may struggle or where they just need more time. To do this, we need to be very careful about warmers and lead-ins, link them to the main event, make them relate thematically, topically in some way to what comes next. VAKOG and multiple intelligence informed planning, don't bother, because it doesn't actually lead to any gain in the quality of learning. Pre-teaching vocabulary, do it where there is an absolute need, but be sure that you can justify your choices. And if there is no vocabulary that needs covering, and you can't find a rationale, don't bother. Think of having a glossary, for example, as an alternative. And then towards the end of the class where you're doing focused feedback, there are better ways of the ad infinitum question 1, question 2, question 3. To wrap all of these together, I would say this: keep informed as a teacher. Have a healthy disrespect for things that you are told are right. Inquire, ask, well, where's the evidence for this? How do you know that? More and more, we are learning that evidence-based approaches to teaching and learning, many of which have come from mainstream education, are informing better practice in terms of how we teach. This is a list of some of the articles that I've referred to throughout today's webinar, today's masterclass. I hope they're of use to you. They're also available online. But I'd just like to finish by thanking everyone for attending today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with you next. And to remind you that this is just one of the many masterclasses, I think we're up to around 100 now, that are available on the Gallery Teachers website. This is a great resource for teachers, however much experience you have, there is something for you. Thank you very much indeed. And yeah, let's have that discussion. Thank you. Questioning time-honoured ELT practice is very much at the heart of what all teachers should be doing. As teachers, we want our learners to engage with critical thinking. We want our students to be aware. We want our students to be safe in the knowledge that what they're being taught and how they are being taught is as much as is possible with the mystery of language, the right way to do things. There isn't one right way to teach English, but there are many wrong ways to teach English. And in my view, the wrong way to teach English is using activities, techniques that have been demonstrated to have no value in the classroom. So, for example, that time-honoured belief that teaching or pre-teaching vocabulary was going to help students to read better has been debunked in terms of action research, and that it had no actual benefit at all for the students. All it did was risk losing their engagement and dragging the lesson on unnecessarily. So I think a healthy disrespect for what we are supposed to do. And a critical engagement with our activities as teachers is a really positive thing. And in particular, let's focus on the evidence base for teaching and learning that is emerging and incorporate that into what we do in the classroom for the benefit of our learners.